Hello, everybody, and welcome to this segment of the Michael Brooks Tribute Series. And today we're going to be focusing on spirituality and the left. We have a wonderful panel. I'm really honored to be able to host it. For those that don't know, my name is Brett O'Shea. I'm the host of Revolutionary Left Radio, the co-host of Red Menace and Guerilla History, and I'm also a longtime practitioner of Buddhism and a humble bodhisattva in training. We have with us today Suzin Green, who is a therapist, a meditation teacher, a musician, and author. Her work is deeply rooted in yogic philosophy, psychology, and mantra meditation, and she was one of Michael's beloved teachers and mentors. We also have Marianne Williamson, who is a best-selling author of several books, including A Politics of Love, a handbook for a new American revolution. She is a nonprofit and political activist, spiritual thought leader, and host of the Marianne Williamson podcast. And finally, we have my friend, Professor Adnan Husain, who is a historian at Queen's University of the Medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world, and focuses on cultural, intellectual, and spiritual relations among Christians, Muslims, and Jews. He is currently director of the Schools of Religion and oversees the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project. He also contributes regularly to the David Feldman Show and co-hosts two podcasts, the Majlis and Guerilla History. Thank you all so much for coming on. And I actually thought the best way to begin this conversation, since this is a tribute to Michael and his life, is to ask you, what is your connection with or reflections upon Michael and his work over the years? Maybe Suzin can begin.
Yeah, I should probably go first since I knew him so well. Actually, before I say anything, though, can I just say thank you? It really is an honor and a privilege to be here and to be part of this panel. And I'm just so glad that we're getting to do it. So thank you. And thank you, Lisha. And thank you, Russell, for making this all happen. So Michael, how I met Michael is the same way many people met Michael. I'd been a big fan of the Majority Report, been a fan of Sam Cedar since Air America went live way, way, way back. And then this young guy, Michael Brooks, came on the show, and he was so interesting. And I could always tell when I listened to him that there was something else going on with Michael that was more than just politics. He seemed to be rooted in what I will call consciousness or spirituality, in a way that I'd never heard anyone else on the left, any of the voices on the left, talking. And I'm like, who is this guy? And then as I listened, it turned out he'd grown up in Western Massachusetts. When I left New York in 1971, I moved to the very same town that he grew up in. So it was like, this is so weird. And then he would talk about Ken Wilber. And I'm like, who on the left talks about Ken Wilber? This is bizarre. So for 4 years, I just felt this kinship with him anyway. And then one day on air, he was complaining about his migraines. And he said, if anyone in the audience has any remedies for my migraines, I would be open to hearing them. So one thing about me is I'm actually very introverted, and I don't like to get very public. But I already felt I knew him so well. I just sent him an email, and I said, actually, I can't help you with the physical, but I might be able to help you with the psycho-emotional, sort of underlying psycho-emotional issues. And so here's my website. Check it out. If it's interesting to you, I'll be happy to give you a free session. So I send off the email. I swear, typical Michael, 5 minutes later, I get back a response. Oh my God, this sounds amazing. When can I come? And so he came that weekend, and we started work together. And then for the next 4 years, we just worked together very, very closely and very carefully and very tenderly and very lovingly on all the inner and outer aspects of Michael's life. And so that's how Michael came into my life. And I am certainly forever enriched for the connection that I had with him. And, what can I say? I mean, his death, there was so many tragedies, just like tragedy upon tragedy upon tragedy of his death. And one piece is, I saw what was happening. I saw where he was going. And he was like just getting ready to soar. And that he was pulled down at that moment is just the most heartbreaking thing. So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Marianne, would you like to go next?
Yeah, Suzin, I'm so sorry to hear that. That's my condolences. I never met Michael Brooks. And my entrance into what is now considered the left in America, I was both early to the party and late to the party. I come from a generation that was reading Chomsky and Marx in the 60s and 70s. So to me, it's like, none of that's new. But what turned out to be my political tribe, I didn't even know was out there. I was more classic, was reading, I was reading the same stuff, but I didn't know. And I have come to believe that probably he tried to contact my campaign, and I have a feeling was told that he was turned down by someone other than myself. After the campaign, as embarrassing as it is to say this nice guy named Michael Brooks used to reach out to me on social media. I had no idea who he was. I, for some reason, thought he was an older man. And I thought he was this really nice old man who really was a fan. And when he said, will you come on my show? I thought, I'm embarrassed to say, that it was like, sure. Like sometimes when people ask me, they're high school students or something, they have 12 people, and that's sort of where we were. I was just getting to know him, but didn't know he was him. So I am aware now that I really missed out. So I missed out on your heartbreak, but you got to know him. And I didn't, and I'm sorry that I didn't. And I've heard things he said since, and many things make sense. And I'm just so sorry that I missed what was obviously a wonderful experience, which was to know him.
But can I say something that's very beautiful to hear you say that? And again, I wish Michael could be here. We loved you during the campaign. You were our number 2 after Bernie.
Did he try to reach me? Did he try to contact
definitely,
me?
because he really wanted to get you on the show. We were so blown away by your analysis and your presence. It was so wonderful to see you up on the stage, and we were so enraged at these, the talkers, like who just didn't get you. The pundits who didn't get you. It was just like, come on, people. So I just want you to know, from my heart and Michael's heart, you're amazing.
Well, thank you. It takes one to know one. People would come up to me and say, Marianne, you should be on like left-wing podcasts and stuff. And clearly there was someone in my campaign on this and so many things that were actually keeping me from some of the places where I should have been. But it's nice to know everybody now.
Adnan, would you like to go next?
Well, like Marianne, I never met Michael, so I also have no direct connection with him. But unlike Marianne, I had come across him and was a real admirer from afar. And it's so funny to hear you, Suzin, mention that you were a listener to the show and you just reached out, because I actually had so many occasions where I half-drafted an email because I heard him say something that was so profoundly different from other left media hosts and figures that I thought I'd love to be in conversation with him about some of these topics, just because they're so rare that people discuss spirituality and the left. And that was one time I remember a brilliant conversation he was having with Joshua Kahn Russell, who's appeared on on a different tribute episode here, about is there a spirituality of the left and how do you integrate it into activism? And I thought, this is so fresh and important and rare that I would love to somehow contribute to these kinds of discussions. And so for all of those emails that ended up just sitting in my drafts folder, this is a great opportunity at least to say some of the things that I didn't get to say, and that I think what was starting to emerge when you say he was about to take off. I also think that this subject is one that has been so suppressed and so in the margins of mainstream leftist political discourse apart from somebody like Marianne Williamson, who I think has done a lot to kind of, integrate this and make this possible for people to actually talk about it. There was Cornel West, but, on the stage in public media, those two debates did so much to at least break down the borders between these two subjects, and I hope allow for a productive thinking about the integration of those two things, which is what was so wonderful and exciting about Michael Brooks's public persona. It wasn't just something that he did in private, but he felt it was relevant to public politics.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And for my part, me and Michael's shows were taking off in similar time spans, and we had reached out over Twitter a few times, signaling to one another that we were interested in working together, and we couldn't really settle on a topic. We had some interest in like African revolutionaries, and we couldn't really figure out, what would be the best way to collab. And then I think at some point, I don't even remember how, but I remember him speaking about going on a meditation retreat. And this was something that's always been a huge part of my life, and something that at that point I hadn't really brought fully onto my show because I was sort of reticent. I didn't know how would left-wing audiences take this discussion of consciousness and meditation. And he reached out, and we said, maybe this is the topic that we do this together on. And so he came on Rev Left, and we had what still today is one of the most downloaded episodes all time on Rev Left, with this very intense conversation between both of us about not only spirituality, but particularly its role on the left and how it fits in with Marxism, and what are some of the biases of the left against this stuff. And then he really started talking towards the end of his life about integral theory, about, this inner transformation happening alongside and in parallel with this outward transformation. And after his passing, I was obviously, devastated, like everybody that heard about it. And, one of the things I walked away from that conversation and after his death was that, maybe I can use my platform to continue these sorts of discussions, over and above my own reticence and fear and self-consciousness about it. I really have to carry this torch forward in my own humble way, as other people are as well. And so that's how I met Michael. And it was only that one conversation that we really had, but it was an important one, and it's one that obviously stuck with my audience as well. But let's go ahead and move on and dive into some of these questions that are relevant to this discussion and relevant to what Michael was doing his entire life, but especially related towards the end of his life, which is this work around spirituality. And all of us, I think, at different times have sort of shown some hesitation about using the term, because it is one of those terms that is so easily misunderstood and so easily it means whatever it means to the individual. So with that said, what does spirituality mean to you? And what are your thoughts on the term itself? And is it helpful, or is there better, more precise language to use when discussing these things? Maybe Suzin, you could take this first as well, just to keep the order going.
Okay, I was hoping we could throw this one to Marianne first, but I'll give it a shot. That word spirituality, I have a really hard time with that word. Every time I do one of these programs, I always look. I never even remember the definition. I always have to look up the definition that morning, and it never really satisfies me. But this morning, the Oxford Dictionary told me that spirituality is being more interested in matters of spirit and soul than in matters of physical and material reality. And I read that and I just get really annoyed, because to me, if like spirituality is anything, it's a complete integration of spirit, soul, and material physical world. And so to me, spirituality is a worldview where we're moving into an internal spaciousness where we are present in reality. We're present with the world exactly as it is. And that's enough for me. And I find in my own personal journey, the more I keep dropping down into, let me just be present with what is, let me be in reality, that's when I drop into the spaciousness where compassion and wisdom and clarity and insight and inspiration and ultimately love resides. And so to me, spirituality tends to be a distraction word from the pure experience of being alive in this moment and being present with each other in the most alive, awake, infused with loving kindness and curiosity than we can possibly summon. And that's enough spirituality for me. I don't need any more than that.
Yeah, Marianne, would you like to go next?
Well, words are but symbols. For me, I like the word. It's not that my beliefs are different than Susan's, but I relate to the language differently. I heard Bernice King, Martin Luther King's youngest daughter, speaking the other day, and she said, "My father always spoke from his spirit man." Mm-hmm. So to me, to say that we have within us, whether you call it the Holy Spirit, whether you call it the Buddha mind, whether you call it the Shekinah, whether you call it the Spirit, it doesn't matter. I find something very profound in the notion that I am more than my body. And I believe that the way to be most comfortable in our skin is to know that we're not our skin. Mm-hmm. The way to be most comfortable in our body is to know that we are here for more than the body's purposes. And in the Course in Miracles, it says that enlightenment is a shift in self-perception, mm-hmm. from body identification to spirit identification. If you identify more with your spirit, then you see your body as the means and not the end. You see yourself as serving the ages rather than serving the circumstances of one incarnation. You see yourself as there to give rather than the constant temptation to think it's all about me. So I think spirituality is very meaningful and is inherently integrated. Because just like when you look at the Christian cross and you look at the Jewish Star of David, something they both have in common visually is that they represent the intersection of the two planes, the vertical and the horizontal. We're both. But to me, if my level of being or spirit precedes my understanding of the level of my doing, then I have a different sense of who I am and a different sense of why I'm here. And if I feel that I'm more than just this flesh and blood, that life, that my physical birth was a continuation, not a beginning, that my physical death is a continuation and not an end, I am less vulnerable to the constant assaults by which my mind would be shrunk and damaged and poisoned by a belief that this is all there is and this is all that matters and you're alone and the world is really scary and what they're going to do to you is going to mess everything up. You're just lifted. You're more human. So to me, the spiritual path is what enables me. I'll tell you something. I don't know how people are making it today without a spiritual path. Mm. And I think that's one of the reasons why there's so much psychopharmacological use. Mm-hmm. People say I have an anxiety disorder. I'm like, the world is an anxiety disorder. Mm-hmm. That's all it is this hallucinatory belief that this material plane is all there is. The soul cannot feel comfortable there. And if the soul can't feel comfortable, how can the soul feel empowered? And how can the human personality or psyche know what the hell I'm alive for? Well, that's what spirituality is to me.
See, that's why I wanted her to answer first. You see, she's so articulate.
No, you were very articulate. I'm glad we got to some of that language.
Yeah, well, I think, those are wonderful reflections. My approach would just have been very much in coordination, in a parallel way, to just assert simply that it's about engaging what it means to be fully human. Mm-hmm. And obviously, as both Suzin and Marianne were saying, there's clearly some needs, some dimensions that aren't going of ourselves that aren't going to be satisfied by a pure materialist or rational approach to everything. We are emotional beings. We're psychological. We have psychological differences. We have personalities that are different. So what does it mean to really fully be human? It has to be somehow putting ourselves in balance as a whole person. And that means acknowledging that we are more than just what we think or what we can objectively demonstrate and prove, that we are complex. And so that, spirituality is just attempting to align our inner life and all of those complexities, to put them in balance, coordinate them, integrate them better so that we can engage relationally with the world around us, with the people around us, with the cosmos and and nature, in a way that brings out our full potential individually and collectively as a society. So that's one thing that I think is important to think about, and I think was very important in the way that Michael Brooks articulated it, is that it isn't just a solipsistic turn inward for oneself in a selfish way. It is about reorienting how you can engage with others, and that it is social in some ways. Spirituality is not just a individual turn away from society, which is sometimes the way it's portrayed or represented.
I want to add to that, it is the opposite of the sense of the separate self. It is the affirmation that there's only one of us here. It's the affirmation that the spirit does not stop at the confines of the flesh, and that therefore what I do to you, I am doing to myself. So to me, it's the fact that it has been so caricatured, and by the left even more than by the right, as something of less intellectual depth and less understanding of what's going on here, is not only stupid from a political perspective, but so insulting to traditions that have lasted thousands of years.
Yeah.
And whose adherents were at least as smart as you.
Yes. Amen, sister.
As a medieval historian, I always confront that with my students, is that they think, well, it's a world where everyone believed in religion, so they must have been much more stupid than us.
The Western arrogance and the modern arrogance.
They didn't have science. They didn't know how to explain.
They didn't know.
As if we really explain and understand our world. We are in the grip of such confusion in a strange world that's so politically in turmoil. There's so much going on. So the arrogance to think that you can just dispense with wisdom wherever you may be able to find it. It's not as if we're in such a strong position that we can...
We've done so well.
Yeah, we've done so well. Let's just abandon like whatever resources may be available to us. So...
And once again, the left even more than the right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I just wanted to touch on a couple things before we move on. This conception of solipsism, that spirituality is this thing where you go and you become more obsessed with the self, or you go into a cave to navel gaze or whatever. And the exact opposite, as you've all alluded to, is true. And whether we talk about it as the negation of self, like in the Buddhist tradition, anatta, no self, or the radical expansion of self, what it really boils down to is the fact that the sense of a separate little trembling self behind the eyes and between the ears that is fundamentally separate from not only the natural world, but from all other beings. That's the fundamental illusion that I think all forms of spirituality, whether Christian mysticism, Hinduism, Buddhism, or Sufism, or whatever, all get at in different ways. And that spaciousness that Suzin was talking about, it can be hard to understand, because a lot of the stuff that we talk about in spirituality isn't, or at least it is post-intellectual or more than mere intellectual understanding. So when you say something like loving awareness or this spaciousness within, people who haven't had those experiences can sometimes either not understand it or try to over-intellectualize it. And it really is, at the end of the day, a visceral experience that one has and that one can practice in a way to grow. And I've noticed in my meditation practice, at first when I started meditating, I was kind of lost. I didn't really know what I was doing. I didn't have a community. But over time, that spaciousness within really, really grows. And it becomes a place that you can more and more reside in and have a sense of real groundedness and contentment, as well as radical springs of compassion for other beings. And I recently, not to get too personal, but several weeks ago, me and my wife lost a pregnancy. And it ended in a really sort of tragic, random, and quick way. And that's a devastating experience, but it was precisely my spiritual practice that I've cultivated over the years, that it allowed me to not run away from the emotions of sadness, not repress the emotions of sadness, not think about how tragic it was, but to be present with my own suffering in a way that was compassionate, and that's one of the things I think, as Marianne says, these things that the left get wrong. A lot of people on the left are very compassionate for others. It's very hard, and sometimes much harder, to be compassionate for yourself. But that ability to really hold your own suffering in a compassionate, loving way can oftentimes be the foundation from which you can then extend outwards and show that compassion to others. So that's what I would offer forward as a approach to this question.
So sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
I think every system, and very, very sorry about your loss.
Thank you.
I think every system, every person, every organization has to be willing to look in the mirror. And I don't think the left should be so self-congratulatory about its compassion towards others. Mm. There's a mean streak in the left as much as there's a mean streak in the right. And sometimes the compassion on the left is more of an easy compassion. We have more compassion for people on the other side of town. We have more compassion in our policy views for people on the other side of the world, which is not nothing, which is important. But sometimes I think we're kidding ourselves if we think that in terms of our own interpersonal reactions, interactions with people, that we are more compassionate than others. And I think ultimately, if you're not more compassionate with yourself, you have a difficult time being more compassionate to those in front of you and vice versa. I also think when you said that people don't understand what this spaciousness is, and so they mock it, there's a real dishonesty here. Yes, they do. They've had sex when in love. They've been in their mother's arms when they were a baby. They go to therapy and talk about how much they long for it as much as everyone else does. Mm. They're human beings. And the intellectual arrogance there, much like Adnan was talking about, the arrogance towards people thousands of years ago, was that Leonardo da Vinci didn't really understand anything. But we know. I think there's a lot of intellectual dishonesty there. They cry in despair in the middle of the night just as much as we do. And then they have the audacity to mock people who are trying to bring that depth of the human experience into political conversation.
Yeah. Incredibly profound, absolutely. And we touched on this a little bit, but maybe we can dive a little deeper. And Marianne is definitely already getting at some of the core points here. But, there is also some sense of pseudo-spirituality that abounds. Sometimes it's shallow self-helpism masquerading as profundity. And this can also lead to a lot of confusion. So I know we already touched on it, but maybe everybody can have another go at this, which is, what are some of the most common misconceptions about spirituality that you encounter? And how can we maybe help set the record straight with regards to some of this confusion and mockery that surrounds these discussions? Adnan, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think we have started to talk a little bit about this. I do think that it's clear that in our late stage consumer capitalism under neoliberalism that there's so much atomization. People feel fragmented and isolated and alone, and that's part of the reason why, because we have a problem that we're divorced from a sense of meaning, from a sense of connection, from values of solidarity, and everything in this society militates against that, that people do need, clearly there's some kind of crisis of meaning. And the temptation is that there are a few temptations or a few responses that this can lead to. One is, of course, fundamentalist religions that provide some sort of surety and identity that seems really solid by excluding others and directing these anxieties and problems in a different way. And that's, of course, a real temptation. And one can understand why the left has had problems with the hierarchical, orthodox, patriarchal forms of traditional religions that have been used as instruments for oppression in many cases. But these are, of course, complex, phenomena that have much more than just that to them. But one of the other outcomes seems to be forms of neoliberal spirituality, you might say, where it is this turned solipsistic, inward, for self-valorization or aggrandizement that doesn't reach out and connect to other people. That I would say that's really the problem with it. And so what it can turn into, one outcome of it seems to me is that sometimes it means that people choose their spiritual practices and beliefs in the way that they do as consumers. I like this, and you've got a lot of choices, and you just sort of choose and make an eclectic arrangement for oneself. And of course, I'm not against people finding what brings meaning to them and works for them. But I would say that one thing that I think is misunderstood perhaps sometimes about spirituality is that you can't just divorce the practices as techniques away from their contexts and their histories. They developed in human society for reasons, and that at the very least we ought to be able to engage the deeper and profound context in which these develop to have a kind of coherent approach to things. I think that's one issue that we find with some aspects of modern neoliberal spirituality, I would say.
Suzin, would you like to go next?
Yeah, it's such a big topic, and I completely agree with everything that Adnan is saying. I think we're such a capitalist consumer society, and we've turned so much quote unquote spirituality into yet another thing to just purchase. And I find that very discomforting. I came up in a Hindu yogic tradition. It was mostly a meditation mantra tradition. I spent a lot of time living in ashrams and did for 17 years pretty intensive daily practice. Part of that world is devotional chanting, which a lot of people know today as kirtan. And because I'm a musician, when I first stumbled onto the yoga path and the chanting, I was like, oh my God, this is like a musical. I get to sing as part of my practice. This is amazing. So I've been, how can I say, just a committed chanter, devotional chanter for over 40 years. And somewhere along the line, those of us who back in the early days were just in ashrams doing devotional chanting began coming out more and more into a public arena. And suddenly the American Kirtan movement was born. And suddenly I was on the road touring yoga centers and festivals, and more American Kirtan artists were coming out as how can we say, devotional musicians. The problem was, I watched the scene that had started it as very, very pure, and by pure I mean it wasn't about commercial. It wasn't commercialized, but little by little it became more and more commercialized until it was more like everybody just wanted to be a rock star. And the last festival that I presented at several years ago, I was just like, I can't do this anymore. I don't want to be part of a world that's all about projection and image and being like a kirtan rock star. I have no interest in that. I don't want to be a superstar in the yoga scene. The whole idea seems to me very oxymoronic. And so for me, that's the problem that I see is the commercialization of true spiritual seeking. And I think we then get a lot of people who are presenting themselves as teachers or authorities, who are actually in one of the yogic concepts is of being very half-baked. And they're very half-baked, and yet people who are very, very innocent and very genuine and really, really, really searching and seeking and looking for answers and looking for teachers. And people who really shouldn't be out there teaching become gurus. And there's a lot of very messy power dynamics that one sees. And I think a lot of people have been harmed by people who are just out there presenting themselves as teachers when they're not really ready. So it's a rather long-winded, I'm sorry for going on for so long, but it's a very concerning thing to me that still goes on. I mean, how many years ago, Chingpa Rinpoche back in the 70s wrote the book Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. And it was right on, however many years ago that was, and it's right on today. Spiritual materialism is rampant right now. And I find that very disturbing. Yeah.
Marianne?
Every group of people has its shadow element.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But its shadow element is not who they are. I don't know any self-help authors who've dropped bombs on Baghdad. I mean, an area of people that has not confronted the military-industrial complex, has not confronted neoliberalism the way it should, has not confronted so many of the injustices that are endemic in our society, to all of a sudden find this target. I have seen the same things Adnan and Suzin have seen. I have been as disturbed by it, Suzin, in my field, I definitely have. But I can also tell you that people who know nothing about that world are now painting that brush. And I'm sorry, not everybody's a spiritual teacher. It's someone who just went to a weekend workshop and then puts up a banner that says spiritual teacher. And I agree with you that does exist. And I agree with you it's not a good thing. And I actually have been a critic of that for decades. Mm-hmm. I've been talking about how the apolitical nature of so much of that was wrong. Mm-hmm. But I also now have been at the effect of people who see anyone who's having a spiritual conversation and project onto us that we are that. So I see that as a real limitation on where this whole thing can go. And many people are serious spiritual teachers and are serious spiritual students and do not deserve that projection. It's like the difference between serious people who really understand deep astrological issues versus what's in the newspaper. And I think that our, like I said, I don't know any self-help authors who bomb Baghdad.
For sure. I'm sorry. Yeah, of course.
And I also know from deep personal experience that there is beneath all that whipped cream, some of which is bad. I'm not denying or disagreeing with anything either of you have said, actually. But beneath all that, there are the people who are there who help people when they're dying, help the addicts, help the grieving, help the desperate. And if they're within a religious institutional identity, they're given respect. But if it's outside and a spiritual non-denominational one, too often there's this assumption of a lack of intellectual depth, a lack of cultural depth, I don't think is deserved. I know it's not deserved.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about...
I know what you're talking about, and I agree with you. I don't disagree with it, but I also think that stereotype, excuse me, I mean, we can also talk, we could talk about any group of people and any profession. There aren't quack doctors, there aren't quack lawyers, there aren't quack accountants.
For sure.
There aren't quack politicians. But why is it only in this field where, I'm very concerned? The ego goes with us whatever field we're in. And I know in my own case, having seen how that works, well, I don't want to get ahead of where you're going with questions about politics and political power, but I'll get there when we're talking about that.
Yeah, and in fact, let's go ahead and move in that direction right now. So we talked a little bit about, overemphasizing scientific materialism and, in a sort of ironic way. And I know this because I went through a new atheist phase in my young 20s, which I'm very embarrassed about now, but very much become...
Everybody did.
Makes me feel better.
Part of growing up.
Yeah. Especially people coming out of maybe stifling religious environments, they have to go through that phase. And so, but what does the left lose? Because this is a thing on the left, and as Marianne has pointed to several times already, this sort of mockery and dismissal. What does the left lose by overemphasizing atheism and or just by rejecting discussions and efforts like these as more or less irrelevant to political struggle? Marianne, you can go first if you'd like.
Well, first of all, I grew up, and I think I'm not the only one here who grew up at a time. Martin Luther King was a preacher. Hello, he was a Baptist preacher. If you look at American history, first of all, the abolitionist movement grew out of the early evangelicals in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. Many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. Quakers have had a tremendous influence on social justice movements, and Dr. King was a Baptist preacher. So if you look at any major social justice movement in the history of the United States, it grew out of religious communities, number one. Number two, 90% of Americans say they believe in God. Why, if you're really interested in political power, would you start out by insulting 90% of people? Now, religious freedom, we say we care so much about freedoms. Religious freedom is one of the most important pillars of the Bill of Rights, and it is the freedom to worship or not to worship with freedom. And so the freedom to be an atheist is extremely important. And I'm not saying we should denigrate that at all, but it is no more or less important than someone who finds the God of their understanding through AA or through Catholicism or through Hinduism, through Sufism, through Judaism. And I believe that a failure to respect that is no different than failing to respect someone's color, someone's ethnicity. And it's also very selective, very into political correctness. Because some religions, we must be very, very respectful. And then other religions, it's just so easy to make jokes about. And then you say you want political power. And I as a leftist, whose politics were very left, after what I experienced as a candidate, the mockery and the derision came from the left before the right even had a chance to get to me. So... And this is not, the conversation I'm really looking forward to here also is why those of us who are activists feel that our spirituality actually helps us, which is another conversation I can't wait to get. I really look forward to getting to that. But in terms of political power, Martin Luther King certainly, everything he talked about, it's time to inject a new dimension of love into the sinews of human civilization. We must... in order to change the world, he said the desegregation of the American South was the political externalization of the goal of the civil rights movement, but the ultimate goal was the establishment of the beloved community. He said we must have external changes in our circumstances, but also qualitative shifts in our souls. And Bobby Kennedy talked about how the Vietnam War was a contest for the soul of America. Back in the 60s and the 70s, the left was not associated with maybe more agnosticism because it certainly didn't come out of the evangelicals, but this kind of, it's one thing to be an atheist. Being an atheist, that's cool, but it's no more or less cool than being a Catholic or and you look at the social justice movements. When we were growing up, a few of us, a couple of us on this call anyway, there were the social justice, something happened simultaneously with both Catholics and Jews. When I was growing up, Catholics and Jews institutionally were major left-wing forces behind social justice issues. At the same time, both Catholics and Jews, Catholics because of abortion and Jews because of Israel, both of them sort of went in this single issue area that led them sort of away from the social justice lefty core. But like when I was growing up, they were very much a part of it. So if you look at the history of the United States, it is aberrational. This is an aberrational chapter where we associate social justice movements with a lack of a religious or spiritual underpinning. That has not been our history. And I think that it has been stupid strategically, given how many millions and millions and millions of Americans out there who tend to lean right use that to project onto us that we are soulless, uncaring people.
Well, that just seems like, as you're saying, a really foolish choice. I mean, Gramsci taught us, if you want to have a left thinker, that you can't abandon any field of culture or base in society to the forces of hegemony. You have to find every moment and every place in which you can engage in struggle against that oppression. And if you do think about it, it's not only even in the history of this country, but just globally, if you think about the importance of liberation theology in Latin America, if you think about the Sufi orders that combated colonialism in the 18th and 19th centuries in West Africa, if you think even of the greatest revolution that took place, there's the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. If you think of the Haitian Revolution, you have to talk about the Bois Caiman voodoo ceremony that touched off the initial rising up against, the slaveholders. And so there are these powerful traditions that I think the real issue is that the left has forgotten how to engage and harness the liberation and the liberatory potential towards social justice. And we've ceded this to the right wing. The right wing has now monopolized what it means to be religious or spiritual. And as you were pointing out, Marianne, far from actually learning how to combat in this sphere, the left has really denigrated these people.
Like we're too cool, we're too smart to even have that conversation.
And that's the thing, is that we think, I understand the value and the importance of, validating reason. It's absolutely essential. We cannot do without it. Our material understanding and analysis of the world, we have to, of course, base it on reason. But is that the sum total of politics? How do you motivate? How do you create a sustainable left culture of resilience? How do you model what you've talked about as the politics of love? You mentioned Martin Luther King. What would the Black freedom struggle in this country have been without the organizational base of the Black church and the liberatory theology, the social ethics that came, from, that religious experience? And I think what it ends up doing, if you cede that territory, if you don't have a sense of what a left spirituality could be or should be, is that you end up leaving people to the counterfeit forms that Michael Brooks just wrote a book against the web about, confronting people like Jordan Peterson, who is clearly responding to a need. There's a need. People really do need a greater sense of purpose and meaning and connection, with one another. And if the left doesn't find ways to harness these emotional, psychological, and spiritual dimensions, it's not only a poor tactic, but it's actually allowing, it seems to me, some rather more dangerous and potentially very conservative ideologies and approaches to root themselves.
I don't think they need to figure out how to do it. They just need to stop denigrating and mocking people who already are. There are people having that conversation in this culture who are made to feel too often by the left that, you're not welcome here. And, reason, what, Thomas Aquinas didn't have enough of an intellect for you? Moses Maimonides, where do we come up with this idea that if you're religious, you're stupid? Or that the Holy Spirit destroys brain cells? I mean, we all know here, meditation only makes you a clearer thinker.
Exactly. Suzin, would you like to add your 2 cents?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just really listening to this conversation and just wondering, what is the problem and what keeps coming to mind is fear. I think that, like, during the primary drama that we all watched, and here's Marianne Williamson up on the stage being just so articulate and so eloquent and having this just wonderful, wonderful presence and saying everything that we are hungry to hear in the most beautiful way, and then she's mocked. Why is she mocked? I think at a deep level, people are terrified of what is being said. I think talk about atomization. We've been so atomized
Are y'all frozen, or is it just me?
She's frozen on my screen too.
Yeah, Suzin, your video is freezing. If you can hear us. Let's see. I'm not sure if it'll snap
better.
back.
Are we still frozen?
No. Welcome back, Suzin.
So, tell me what you heard me say. Yeah, so I'm talking. So we've been so atomized into these little individual beings, and we've become. We live in a very cramped, horizontal mental space. Like when Brett, before you were talking about the pain that you felt when you lost the baby. And that's just like, heartbreaking. But you were willing to go into the pain. You were willing to really feel through the devastation that had just happened to you and your wife. And the courage to go into that pain and to really feel that pain and not fear the pain and not want to push it away, that, from my experience, that courage is developed and heightened through spiritual work. But let's leave that aside for a moment and just say that, unfortunately, we live in a culture, everybody wants a quick fix. Everybody wants to be medicated as soon as they start feeling a little bit of anxiety. And people are terrified of anything that is not what they already have bought into, what they already believe in. I think part of the reason that there is such mocking of anything, just if we're talking just about the left, I think a lot of that mockery is coming from people's terror of something they probably sense inside of themselves, and it's just so radioactive they can't get close to it. Right? I mean, does that make sense what I'm saying? I think you were touched on this before, Marianne. I know in my own journey, some of my biggest breakthroughs have come when I realized that all the judgment I was having of this person or that person was really, they were just mirroring something inside of myself that I didn't want to look at. And once I was willing to look at, oh my God, I'm the snarkiest, most critical, judgy, controlling bitch that ever walked this earth. Suddenly it's like, and then I can drop down into a much bigger spaciousness, to use that word again, inside of myself, where, oh, it's okay. It's okay. I don't have to judge this person. We're just one anyway. I mean, right back to the spirituality. To me, when we really get down and dirty with what spirituality is, it comes from this profound recognition that we're all one, right? And the whole Buddhist notion of the interconnectedness of all life, and if we're all one, how can I hate the other? Even Donald Trump, it's like, I have to see that I've got that in me also. And I have to be willing to make friends with that in me also, if I'm to be a full person. And I think if we're just critiquing the left, part of the problem of, the identity police, it's so toxic because we're not allowing space for all the incredible, the myriad possibility of human expression. And of course, we need to be kind, loving, conscious, awake, socially justice warriors. But we can do that with a much larger view of seeing that even my enemy is someone that I can make into a friend. I don't know if I'm saying this well. I'm not as eloquent as Marianne, but
don't be silly.
hopefully I'm making the point.
You were saying something very important about suffering. That both of you have talked about suffering. You talked about suffering in terms of the loss of the pregnancy. I think there's a way in which, religion is about dogma and doctrine. Spirituality, there's no dogma or doctrine, but also I don't think we should so easily demean religion either, because there are some genuinely religious people on this planet who are coming from a very, very deep place. I think that what religion/spirituality gives us is an exquisite understanding and appreciation for suffering. And by appreciation, I don't mean as in gratitude, but in appreciating the profundity and the fact that it is in people's lives. And it has been stated here already that spirituality gives you an understanding that you must endure your suffering, that the psyche has an immune system just like the body does. The mind can take a lot of heartbreak and heal itself, just like the body can take a lot of assault and injury and heal itself. And if we do not feel our suffering, then we are more likely to be able to distract ourselves from the suffering of others. So actually, a deeper spiritual understanding and practice is the primary motivator for leftist politics. Once you realize we're all one, you realize you cannot be happy if you realize that 12,000 children on the planet are starving and there's no dearth of food. If you understand the value of suffering, the importance of suffering, you can't as easily be sucked in by big pharma.
Exactly.
In its silver bullet approach to suffering. So I think the deeper spiritual practice and experience is a motivation for the politics of the left. It's almost like leftist politics is the branch, and spirituality is the trunk. Because spirituality is the deeper experience and understanding of what it means to be human. And it's like, Adnan, what you were saying, if you're not bringing into any experience a deeper understanding of humanity, then you can't possibly have a deeper understanding of that, of art, of business, of economics, of politics. Everything becomes skewered, whether it's economics, whether it's politics, everything becomes skewered when people do not enter it with a deeper heart. Because the deeper heart is our deeper humanity. And the problem of the world, Gandhi said the problem of the world is that humanity is not in its right mind. And Freud defined neurosis as separation from self. And the new most powerful political movements of the 20th century were the nonviolent revolutions led by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King said about Gandhi that he was the first person in human history to take the love ethic of Jesus, which to Gandhi was not the love ethic of Jesus, it was the love ethic at the core of all serious spiritual pursuit, and take it beyond mere personal interaction to make it a large-scale social force for good. And it seems to me that's what Michael Brooks understood. It seems to me that that's what we're talking about here, that this is not separate from leftist politics. This is not separate from a love of social justice. If you stand on a spiritual ground, that means you find injustice intolerable. You find that which is not love intolerable. That means you know that you're on this earth to face it. And let me tell you something else it gives you. It gives you, if any of us are going to be the social justice warriors that we deep in our hearts say we want to be, then we're going to have to get over our fear of death. Because one of the things that spirituality gives you is an understanding that there is a counterforce. You can call it the devil, you can call it the shadow, you can call it Satan, you can call it Satan. The spiritual, no, there is a counterforce, and it's coming after you. And it's coming after you on a personal level, and addiction and obsession and self-destructive forms of whatever nature. It's coming after you. It's going to try to mess with your relationships, and it's going to try to mess with us through politics, just like everywhere else. And I think meditating, it puts you in a nervous system, you put your nervous system in a place where you go, I know they're going to come after me and I can take it. And the worst they could do is kill me, and that's okay too. I mean, this is serious. Spirituality doesn't make you superficial. Superficial spirituality is what takes us deep. And I'm so happy that you're opening this conversation. And it means so much that Michael got that, because I believe it's the greatest expansion possibility that there is for the left in America today.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to say something, because you said something beautiful, Marianne, about this fear of death and the role it plays. And I have some personal experience. I went through an existential crisis for several months in my mid-20s. And it was, in retrospect, I had to deal with my deep-rooted fear of death. Every time I would think about it, I would have anxiety attacks. And it was really holding me back and preventing me from living. And this 4-month period, I was basically forced to think about it 24 hours a day, really at points thinking I was completely going insane. Like, medicine can't fix this. It's this obsessive thinking about my own mortality and the mortality of everybody around me. As that pain and that suffering got more and more acute, and I turned to meditation as my only way to maybe not out of it, but to deal with it, over time, I remember I was driving and I was in the pits of it. And the suffering became so acute, and something broke. I talk about it as being broken inside of me. Something broke open, and my individual suffering and my fear of death cracked open, and it became selfless compassion for the human condition. I was no longer there. I was no longer the center point of suffering, but it became something much bigger than me, and it turned into this radical love and compassion for all beings, because we all have these bodies, we all suffer, and we all die. And, regardless of your relationship to your own death, there is suffering involved when you lose a loved one. Even an enlightened master is going to cry when their child dies, for example. I mean, we can't run from the suffering, but to let it deepen us, to let it connect us with all human suffering, and let it give rise to deep radical compassion for the other. When you literally feel the other to be yourself, you're right, injustice becomes utterly intolerable, and you will do anything to stop it. And after that moment of selfless compassion, my fear of death completely obliterated. I rededicated my life to the service of others. And if that means laying down my life in service of others, I'm not going out looking to become a martyr, of course, but there's that lack of fear of death that says, if I have to lay down my life for something greater or for another, I'm willing to do that. And that can be an incredibly profound tool in the toolbox of the left who want to build a better world.
Yes.
So let's go to the other side of this coin, which is and I think you referenced that you wanted to get to this question. We often hear of struggling on the economic, the political, the social front. Michael also believed in struggling on the spiritual front, on infusing our political movements with the wisdom and the compassion that can really only be found in the mystical traditions that everyone here loves and respects. So can we talk about that, and more precisely what the left stands to gain by sincere engagement with these practices? Anybody can take it.
Well, I'd like to hear Marianne on that.
I know for myself, and I've heard other people talk about being meditators on this, it affects your nervous system. There is a term in Yiddish that the Jews call spilkus. It's when you're like this. And so much energy is coming onto the planet now, both light and dark, by the way. Both forces of enlightenment and forces of devolution, that if your nervous system is not prepared, then instead of being a vase for all the beautiful flowers, you're just shattered. That's where so much of the anxiety comes from. So if you are going to be standing for some of the things that the left stands for, you are by definition repudiating the larger economic and technological and governmental forces of our age, and they come at you. And I know they will say the politics of personal destruction, the get her off the stage, the political media industrial complex will say whatever they have to say, caricature, not necessarily kill you, but they have other ways of nullifying your voice and making sure you're not hurt. Okay? You have to be able to withstand that. And you have to be able to know that. There it is. That's that force, and to be able to endure it, to be able to navigate through it, and ultimately to be able to forgive them, to forgive yourself for the ways that you made it easy for them, to forgive yourself for the ways that you didn't stand in the space the way you should have in the Aikido at the moment. I mean, once again, this is what the getting down and dirty was. And to know that no matter what they throw at you, you're still here. I mean, what would we do without our practices? I know I'd be a bitter woman. I'd be in victim mode. I was abused. Not that the abuse didn't exist, but it's part of the journey. It's on the way. So to me, it's, as I said, it's the preparation of the nervous system. Now, in the Course in Miracles, it says, in all the great religious systems that I know, now maybe you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I've never read about any serious spiritual religious tradition that does not emphasize the morning. Because when we wake up in the morning is when the consciousness downloads one world or the other. And most people, they go directly to their phone, directly to the computer, directly to the newspaper, directly to TV, and they download the consciousness of an increasingly insane, terrified, chaotic world. And then you're mystified why you're depressed by noon. But if you meditate first, you download first the realm of the ultimately real. And if you're emotionally and psychologically grounded in the reality with a capital R, the real with a capital R, then you're human. But it's much like in the New Testament when Jesus said, if you can build your house on sand or you can build your house on rock. If you build your house on sand, then the winds come and the rains come, you're blown away. You build your house on rock, your house remains firm. Your house is your nervous system, your psyche, your humanity, your being. The winds and the rains are coming. If you're going to be involved in politics, the winds and the rains are coming. Particularly in American politics, particularly in American electoral politics, particularly in the corruption of the system today. Oh, the winds are coming and the rains are coming. To me, what spiritual practice is build your house stronger. Build your house stronger. If they were able to knock you down, your house wasn't strong enough. And that to me is what meditation, forgiveness, what I believe in one truth spoken in many different ways, many different traditions, but I believe one truth. And to me, who you are in politics as much as in anything else, who we are is as important as what we do. And Gandhi said that the end is inherent in the means. That's the essence of nonviolence as a political philosophy, that we must purify our hearts. That's what Dr. King said. That's why Dr. King said, they're going to come at you with the dogs. They're going to come at you with the hoses. They're going to spit on you, and you will not fight back. We will not allow ourselves to hate back. Read Testament. That's what Dr. King, that's what all of it was about. That we will refuse to go there. That takes work. That's not cheap, shallow self-help. That is serious work.
Yeah, that's what I would call embodied spirituality. And that is certainly something that Michael was committed to.
Exactly.
In himself. I'm sure you all know in the archetypes of the sacred feminine, one of the most beloved archetypes of compassion is Kuan Yin. It's a Chinese bodhisattva. And her name, Kuan Yin, it means she who hears the cries of the world. She who hears the cries of the world. And that was Michael. Michael heard the cries of the world, and he wanted to tend to those cries. Sometime in the last month before he died, I was asking him, what do you want for your life? And he just kind of got really thoughtful, and he said, I want to do extraordinary things. And then he sort of looked at me and he said, I want to see, and what did he say? See and touch and feel and taste and hear the world, the whole world. I want to embrace the whole world. And yes, and to me, back to the question about what is spirituality, to me, that's what spirituality and what Marianne is talking about. It's like, if we truly love the world, then we want to do everything we can to help repair and mend all the broken places. And whatever it takes for us to do that, including putting our life down, we will do that, and we're doing it out of love. And that, to me, for me personally, that's the goal of life. That's the point of life. And back to the question about the left, I guess somewhere in this conversation, I was thinking, right, it's like we need to develop a template for a spirituality for the left. It would have to be a very big template, and maybe we can have more conversations like this and see if we can begin really developing that template.
I believe Gandhi already did that. Gandhi, and then Dr. King went to India, he studied it, and he brought it back for application to the civil rights movement in the 1960s. When I wrote my book, Healing the Soul of America, I did a deep dive into American history, and then I went, well, what about the spirituality, and how do you put it all together? And then I read Gandhi and King, and I went, it goes back to that arrogance we have. They did it already. They did it already, and they applied it, and they won, by the way.
So it's like we have to take this great foundation and reformat it for this time.
You don't even have to reformat. It's the same thing. Everything we're going through, you're talking about the overreach by monopolistic capitalist forces. It's all the same thing. It's not different. It's just the wheel that keeps on turning around. It's our generation's turn, and the more you know the history, the more there's nothing different here. This is back to the arrogance of our age, right? And I don't even think it's a new template. I think it's the opposite. I think it's we have the template, learn it, read the book, apply it.
But how do we but the question to me is, how do we communicate this to people who see
well, Suzin, you know as well as I do, we have to just practice it ourselves, and then all the ways to extend it will be made available.
Back to embodiment. Yeah.
That's so interesting that you mentioned that those resources are there, which is why we do have to turn to history, and we have to engage these traditions and revive and extend and expand and apply them. It just reminds me of the genius of Martin Luther King. If you listen to his Three Evils speech, it's like it could have been written today. About militarism, racism, and poverty, essentially, right? Like these are the wealth inequality. These are the three evils that we're grappling with, and we need to engage our politics on all those fronts. And he had them grounded. When we've been talking about, this, what does spirituality give to the left? He was very clear, and I think Michael was very fond of actually one of these quotes from Martin Luther King's speeches, that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Yes.
We have to bring these two in communication and in integration to one another in our politics on the left, and do something. It's very similar to also what Cornel West mentioned when he said justice is what love looks like in public. And so that's just, we need to manifest that spiritual understanding that we've been talking about in public in an appropriate way, because as you've been saying, if you really are attuned to the empathy of our common humanity because of your spiritual development, it is intolerable, the injustice and the suffering of others. And so it's really, that kind of uniting those two together is what would give the left actual power to be successful and effective. And I think that's what Michael was also concerned with, is you can't isolate these things from one another if you hope to actually win, if you actually hope to achieve.
Move mountains. Moving mountains is small compared to what you can do. We have to move mountains. And then, everybody talks about Marx and Chomsky. Just add to that Gandhi and King. There's a book called Testament of Hope. That's the collected writings and speeches of Dr. King. You can open it anywhere.
And I just wanted to add in, I remember Michael's last conversation with Suzin. He mentioned alienation, right? And in Marxist language, we talk about being alienated from the product of your labor. But Marx also went deeper and said you become alienated from your fellow human, you become alienated from yourself, and you become alienated from the natural world. And what we're seeing right now, the crises that the humanity is facing, stems out of this sense of separation, not only from one another in the form of militarism and poverty and not caring for one another, but this alienation from the natural world that allows us so easily to see ourselves as so separate from it that we can more or less trash it. And once you engage in these spiritual practices, you start breaking down that barrier of separation and division, which is the ego is a machine of division and separation. Once you start peering through that and breaking that down, you start to see yourself as really a force of nature and inseparable from the earth. And whether you're thinking it spiritually, religiously, or scientifically, start to come to the understanding that you are literally the earth becoming conscious. You're the cosmos waking up to itself. And particularly on the front of environmentalism, when we go out into the world and we want to save the planet, save the biodiversity and the biosphere, you realize that you are actually the earth coming to its own defense, that, that we are the forces of nature acting in nature's best interest. And so that's another thing, that's another way that these practices, I think, cash out. And so much of the talk gets to this breaking down of division and separation and feeling not intellectually, but viscerally, your deep connection to all other beings and to the natural world out of which we bubble up out of, right? We're not alien to the world. We're not put into the world from some other place. We come up out of the world itself, and we are Earth. And I think that can be incredibly powerful as well. And it could help the leftist causes in the fight for, against climate change, against pollution, etc.
Well, if you have reverence, reverence is not about what you're reverent towards. If you're reverent towards all of life. And so the reverence that is cultivated by the spiritual life definitely goes towards nature. And I want to talk more about that in terms of women, which is something we haven't touched on here. But also, before Marx was a political philosopher, he was a humanitarian philosopher. And when you read his humanitarian works, including, there was a woman named Shuala Smith Firestone, who was an early feminist and Marxist. His work, what you just said, alienation of, Marx was speaking from a deeper level. And his early works, I think a lot of people might want to read. Same with Adam Smith. Yeah. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. His work has been taken by the right wing and the ultimate corporatists, but that's not where he started. Back in pagan culture, there were women in most European villages. They were called the witches, which meant wise women. And they held aloft in the consciousness of human beings a sense of divine partnership with the earth and with the sky, and with the waters, the rivers, the oceans. The environmental crisis began with the split which occurred when early Christendom completely overturned, and Adnan would know, this is your field, obviously, overturned the notion of divine partnership with nature. Instead, said that God had given the earth to mankind for man's utilitarian purposes. That right there was the beginning of the environmental crisis. The split in human consciousness, which was held together by the women, and it was one of the primary reasons why the destruction of the so-called witches was so important to them. Because if you want to gain control, one of the things you want to get rid of is the free-thinking woman. Free-thinking woman who is more likely to hold a sense of the divine connection of all life, and also is more likely to be raising free-thinking children. So free thinking, when you have reverence and free thoughts, then systems of control always want to get rid of that. And usually a profound repository of both reverence, human connectedness, interrelationship, and free thought is in women. And the misogyny of today, just like we've gotten, we abolished slavery and we dismantled segregation, but clearly we did not get rid of racism. It just burrowed down more deeply. Mm-hmm. I think we need to look at that in terms of misogyny as well. Mm-hmm. And on the left as much as anywhere else.
Totally.
Because anytime you have any system that says you have to look at it this way, and the left does this as much as the right. You have to look at it this way. You have to say it this way. You have to language it this way, or you're dead practically. That makes it real hard for women. Mm-hmm. And any woman who feels that she's just going to toe the line and say it the way they told me I should say it and think about it the way they told me I should think about it is annihilating herself. Mm-hmm. And I think also all the spiritual and religious talk, if it's a man and he's a minister, then he can be on the left and he will be heard.
Well, definitely the gendered politics deserves its own show, for sure, its own discussion. But just on that, in terms of the ecological question, obviously we have a lot to learn from indigenous knowledges and indigenous traditions, and to respect and understand that they had a very holistic and integrated way of life that engaged their continuities with the natural world, and whatever forms of spirituality, if we wanted to use those terms, were deeply integrated in a sustainable and living relationship with nature that we've too often forgotten. And of course, monotheistic religion, other forms have introduced this division between human being and nature, the androcentric orientation. Lynn White in 1967 wrote this amazing piece. He was a medieval historian of science and technology, and he wrote a piece for Science magazine, the historical roots of our ecological crisis, and he essentially blamed monotheism, and in particular Western Christianity's ultimate androcentrism of giving dominion over nature to humankind. And that's why we have to we really do have to confront that conception, both for its gendered dimensions, but also just for the way it divorces us from nature. It just reminds me of a verse in the Quran that is about how humankind fancies and thinks that this was created, this earth, this world was created for them. And God in the Quran, right, is saying to humankind, you know nothing of the purposes of this. It was not created just for you. And so we have to understand that taking an androcentric perspective of the earth and the environment is actually deeply unspiritual, because in fact our spirit is to be connected with the natural world and integrated into it, rather than divorcing and separating ourselves from it. And so indeed we do have a lot, I think, to learn from indigenous traditions, and it reminds us that this is a settler colonial project in our history, and that part of the tragedies and the great problems in our history are not only this original sin of slavery, but also one of dispossession of the indigenous people for the appropriation of this land in such a way that not only dispossessed its people, but reinforced that division between us and this natural world that we inhabit here in North America.
And in those old indigenous and in ancient cultures, the young men did not go to war until the older women gave them the go-ahead. So the wisdom of women cannot be separated. And like I said, you often see that accompanied by destruction and control of women.
Absolutely.
And Marianne Eisler was the one who wrote the book where she talked about the dominator model versus the partnership model, and how in many matriarchal cultures you're more likely to see the partnership model than the dominator model.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right, so we're zooming into the last question or two, and I want to direct this second to last question primarily to Suzin, given her specific connection to Michael, but would love to hear everybody's thought after that if possible. And the question is this, where was Michael's spiritual practice heading toward at the end of his life, and how was it impacting the direction of his political work?
That's a great question. I would say he was shifting into wanting to devote more time to his inner life. And in fact, so ironic, we had a 3-hour FaceTime call the night before he died. Just so happened. And if anyone had told me he was going to be dead 12 hours later, I would not have believed it. He was vital. He was incredible. He was feeling really strong, and he was thinking about what next. And he was saying to me, really talking about this year, 2021, this was back in July, saying, next year, I really want to focus on my inner life. I really want to commit to a deeper inner practice. I need to really begin bringing more and more and more of the importance of an inner life into my public platform. I want my next book to be about how essential it is for people on the left to be integrating a spiritual vision with their political vision. So he was very much moving in the direction that we're talking about in this conversation that we're having, and very passionately. Was already beginning to think about how could he pull back more of his public persona so he could devote more time. He wanted to write another book. His next book was going to be about the integration of politics and spirituality. And he was ready to really come out as a seeker. Mm-hmm. So that's where he was.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe the best way to wrap this conversation up is, reflecting again on Michael's life and how best can we all carry on the legacy of Michael's life and work. He had his politics, as you said, he had his spiritual side. So, as a final question, anybody can take it. Maybe Suzin, if you want to go first, you can again, given your connection to him. But yeah, how can we all best carry forward his spirit and his legacy?
I think what we're doing here is a part of that. I do think that he had an incredible vision, and it was steeped in love, really, really steeped in love and kindness, and steeped in curiosity, and steeped in a very, very strong longing to help the world. And so I think we just have to keep committing to embodying that and doing that in whatever way we can. And those of us who have a large public platform, I think, need to just keep speaking out and supporting movements. Those of us who have a smaller platform have to work in the smaller circles that we work in. Just kind of keep up the good fight. Marianne and I guess we're about the same age. We've been around long enough to see. We've been fighting this fight for a really long time, and it sometimes seems like, I was thinking several months ago, am I always going to be on the losing side? But we just have to keep on fighting, and never give up, never, ever, ever give up. I think is, and to always remember Michael. We should do, Russell, if you're listening, we should do these conferences every year. We want to keep Michael, the presence of Michael, very much alive, even though the physical Michael is gone, but the energetic Michael is still very present. The consciousness of Michael is still very present, and I, for one, am completely committed to doing whatever I can to just keep contributing to the legacy of his name and his work.
Adnan, would you like to go next?
Yeah, one thing that was so inspiring about Michael was his confidence to actually talk about these things. It's not easy to discuss them. He had one conversation with Joshua Kahn Russell, who said, I guess I'm coming out of the closet spiritually. And that's how it often feels like, is that it takes courage to actually expose one's interest and one's sense that this is necessary to their politics, because that's not the vocabulary that we typically use. So I found that inspiring, and I've received confidence from Michael's example to actually involve those issues in left circles and discussions. And I've been surprised actually how much it resonates with people, that they are interested. It's just that it hasn't been part of the discussion that they've been introduced to. So that's definitely one thing to continue, is to hold these discussions, but to be more confident in expressing how and why it is we're committed, absolutely committed to social justice because of our spiritual ethics and our spiritual practices. So that seems important, that we have to build also, a left culture that isn't just about dogma, doctrine, and repeats the structures that we see in hierarchical religion of unaccountable authority or of dogma and doctrine. I read a really fantastic article by Jones Manoel in the Black Agenda report that said, it was titled, Western Marxism Loves Purity and Martyrdom, but Not Real Revolution. And what he was arguing is that we've taken over and secularized some aspects of Christian church culture, that institutional culture, and just brought it into the left, that we want like martyrdom rather than actually winning. So we valorize people who fall in the struggle, but not people who actually achieve material, success in left politics. And, we love purity, ideological purity, that we have to absolutely think in the same way and have the same theory. And if you don't agree, then you're a deviation. You're a heresy, a political heresy, in the same way that the church used to condemn dissent as religious heresy. And so we have to build a culture that would incorporate those spiritual values in the left and inform our politics with that love, that sense of solidarity, to be able to forge coalitions and to make an effective left politics. We actually need to imbibe some of the spiritual values that Marianne's been discussing and you've been discussing, Suzin, because otherwise it really isn't going to be successful and sustainable in the long term. So those seem to me lines and avenues to continue working and thinking on to keep up Michael's amazing legacy.
Mm-hmm. Marianne, final thoughts?
Well, I agree with everyone, everything that's been said here. And the kind of purity that you're talking about is not pure at all, because it's very exclusionary. And there's a lot of very dogmatic, hierarchical thinking on the left today, in all the ways that you described. When I ran for president, I saw two completely different universes. One was actually being with voters. Voters totally hear this. You don't need to use the word spirituality. But voters, whether they're on the right or the left, or progressive or conservative, enough with the labels, understand deep humanity. And I found that when discussing political issues from the issue of our deep humanity, because I would be careful with my wording, because I appreciate, as a Jew also, because I come from a minority religion, I know how important is the tradition of keeping our political conversation secular. But that never meant to me leaving out values and morality and the depth of what spirituality means. So I found the voters all around the country so open to that. It's the political media, political complex that is from some other universe of the mockery and the derision. And I think the left is infected by that as much as the right is. So I'm so glad these conversations have been brought into the open, because I agree with Suzin. There's no answer. The answer is the process. And you're not going to have any deep answers in life until you're asking deep questions, until you're looking in the mirror. And so I really appreciate being here. Now, as far as Michael, I just want to end by saying, as I said before, I didn't know Michael. But the day after he died, all these people whose voices I knew to be edgy, angry, brilliant perhaps, but still tinged with a little mean, were so heartfelt and so kind and so sweet and so deeply human. Death has a way of reminding us that we're alive. Death has a way of reminding us what matters. And so even though I know that had his life on earth been longer, he would have been given us great gifts. There was a gift of rehumanization that overcame his death, sadness and tragedy and death and pain and sorrow, and all the ways we're saying, sometimes takes us to our deeper humanity. And also, because of the spiritual traditions we believe in, he got his wish. He wanted to be more about his inner life. That's all that exists for him now. So I'm very sorry I didn't get to meet him. I understand on a human level what a tragedy, a 36-year-old man with everything to live for. I understand all the human part of it, even though I didn't have the honor of meeting him the way you did. But if we're to really hold the space, he's here. I mean, we're talking about spirituality. That's beyond time and space, quantum field. He's here.
Totally.
He's here going, I'm here. So let's not only continue in his name, but let's continue knowing that he is part of the all that is. And we'll see him in due time.
And that's a beautiful place, I think, to wrap up this wonderful conversation. Still so much to be said, and we can all carry forward and say those things going forward in our own ways and in our own platforms. And as Marianne said, I think it really is a testament to Michael's impact, that when he passed, all these divisions on the left, people that are hating each other and going to each other, stabbing each other in the back constantly, everybody came together only for a brief, beautiful moment to pay homage to Michael. And I think that speaks volumes about the impact that he made on all of us. So thank you so much to our wonderful guests, Marianne Williamson, Suzin Green, and Adnan Hussein. Thank you to Russell and the whole TMBS crew for allowing me to host this important conversation. A special shout out to Michael's sister, Lisha, who not only helped make this entire tribute series possible, but whose profound love for Michael and dedication to the continuation of his legacy is simply unmatched. And finally, rest in power to Michael Brooks. Your enormous contributions toward building a better, more loving, more equitable world live on, and you will never be forgotten. Solidarity and good night.